not be possible in the time that we have to attempt a complete synopsis of the story of the ring, and we hope that those of you who have not read it lately will take the opportunity after the discussion to at least consider it in an abridged form, or perhaps read the libretto of the operas. The story itself has its greatest interest for us in its philosophical overtones. But there are a few points which I think we should first make as clear as possible. The ring, as presented by Richard Wagner, is perhaps his greatest ritual drama. Critics are of the opinion that from a musical standpoint, the finest works of the composer are to be found in his opera Tristan and Isolde. But certainly it is in the great music ritual dramas of the Ring and the Grail cycle that the master reveals a kind of genius which causes him to stand out unique among the great composers of the world. The wealth of material from which he could select those parts suitable to his purpose were of such nature and quality, this wealth was of such nature and quality as to lend itself particularly to the preparation of a great epic work. And we must also at this point mention that the Teutonic mythology of Richard Wagner is more or less his own. He derived from a great many sources, but he combined, organized, and interpreted from a viewpoint peculiar to himself. And as a result, we find many breaks in the older tradition which he makes no effort to fill. And we find him dominated by certain metapolitical and psychopolitical intensities of his own. Thus, the symbolism of the ancient writings has been adapted to a usage for a presentation which was part of Wagner's personal philosophy of life. In spite of these points, however, I suppose that the Ring is the nearest spectacle that we have today which would parallel one of the great mystery rituals of antiquity. The old rites of Greece, Egypt, India are no longer available to us. But in the story of the Ring, we find a wonderful unfolding of cosmic drama, much in the spirit of the Eleusinian or Sabasian rites of the ancient classical civilizations. Incidentally, we must also note that like most rituals, the story of the Ring is susceptible of more than one interpretation. And this is especially true when we compare it with the Eddas and Sagas from which the basic themes were derived. We know, for example, that long ago, perhaps at about the beginning of the Christian era, an Asiatic tribe migrated across Europe and established centers of culture in the European and Central European areas we know today, finally centering in the Scandinavian region, where this tribe established its dynasty and began its cultural development. This wandering tribe and its source might cause us to suspect that certain Eastern and Asiatic influences were present in the forming of Nordic culture. And this proves to be largely true when we examine the matter carefully. I have taken a number of the earlier works and examined them in terms of ritual. And I am convinced that we could demonstrate, in fact could reconstruct, a complete system of initiation into old rites and ceremonies such as those of the Droats, at that time dominating the religious life of the area. Thus we should bear in mind that these stories have levels or layers of interpretation, and we shall try to distinguish only two of these this evening, and we cannot carry either story to its complete and reasonable end. We can only intimate And for convenience and for the brevity of time, we must also mingle the sagas and eddas in a number of instances with the Wagnerian synopsis. I'll try to point out these interpolations as they come along, but we may not be able to do so in each instance. The great music drama of the Ring, so-called, is generally regarded as being divided into 3 operas and a prologue. The operas themselves, the Valkyrie, Siegfried, and the Götterdämmerung, form the basic unit of the work. To these is given a shorter but very important prologue, which sets the entire situation and gives us the beginnings and early developments of the great thematic structure which Wagner uses in order to explain his symbolism in terms of music. This prologue is called the Rheingold, and it is natural then that we should begin our consideration with some interpretation of this phase of the problem. The Rheingold actually begins with the magnificent theme of the Rhine music. And in the Germanic concept, the Rhine takes the place of the great ocean, the great deep, the great sea from which all life springs. The Rhine is therefore undoubtedly and inevitably the river of life, the stream of universal consciousness, moving forever, continuing with its strange, melodic, haunting melody down through the ages and down through the great valley of the Rhine. The Rhineland itself becomes, of course, the world, watered by the river of eternal life. And upon this water, the great drama of life unfolds, and along the shores of the Rhine take place the various incidents of Siegfried's great Rhine journey. Siegfried is the Gothic or Germanic form of the Nordic deity Sigurd, and the Sigurd saga of the Nordic area supplies the principal elements of the story. But before the arrival of this important personality in the scheme of things, we have the Rhine flowing on and on. And down in the depths of the Rhine, the sleeping gold. The gold from which is to be pounded the ring of the Nibelung. Now, the Rhine gold itself is guarded by 3 mysterious beings called the Rhine Maidens. And the gold obeys the strange cosmic cyclic law that has been imposed upon it by the Rhine King. And the Rhine King is the mysterious master of all these things, hidden but the great power of law behind the workings of all the manifestations and phenomena of life. The periodic waking of the Rhine gold, according to the original concepts of the early Nordic rites, would have to do with something that perhaps we can approach on the level of Buddhism most successfully. Because the Rhine gold seemingly represents the potential of individual consciousness sleeping forever within the stream of universal consciousness. Individual consciousness is subject to the laws of the great king of the universe, the supreme power abiding in the recondite parts of space. This individual consciousness, under a cyclic motion, emerges from the universal, remains for a time, and then returns again to the universal sleep. Out of this motion of individual or separate consciousness existing within universal consciousness is finally fashioned the mysterious and fatal instrument of the great music drama, the ring. And this ring, if we study its symbolism in ancient figures and engravings, almost immediately tells us what it is. This ring is the human ego, or ego consciousness, the sense of I amness. And this is the cursed ring, from which there seems to be no escape, and around which the sorrowful tragedy of the inevitable doom of the world hero is built. Now, individual consciousness, finally producing it from itself, egoism, causes to emerge a strange and magical agent. This strange and magical agent is the power of the human ego will, the power which bestows upon all creatures the ability to engage in the strange, fatal conspiracy which we call life. It is this ring, selfness, with its eternal dependencies, which curses everything that it touches, that brings death wherever it brings life. For it is part of the mystery of the ring that all things that live must die. And it is because our Father and the gods knew this upon their mighty palace peaks at Asgard, that they knew before the wonderful cycle started that it must end in tragedy, and that the only way to prolong their own existence was to maintain as long as possible this strange condition of self-existence. Now this ring then, as it is used by Richard Wagner, also has a second meaning. But this meaning is very close to the first and is actually dependent upon it. In Wagner, the power of the ring represents the principle of power itself, the principle which we would call energy, which sleeps in the substance and sea of universal life. It is this power which men have sought to possess since the beginning of time, and upon which they have built their entire legendary concept of progress, of growth, and of all the advancements which we dream about in life and nature. Thus the ring becomes the symbol of man's increasing knowledge of the use of universal energies, which this strange ring, which in its original form was a broken circle, almost always represents. When someone asked the late Professor Steinmetz what electricity was, he replied, power. And it is this tremendous temptation of power, the desire to possess it, the desire to use it, the desire to control all things with it, and the refusal of the individual to return this power to its lawful keepers, that finally brings the drama to its most tragic climax. Now down into the dark depths of the Rhine, the symbol of this endless stream of life, where the sleeping gold is beginning to waken and its gleams bring forth the songs of the Rhine maidens, there crawls and creeps a very strange creature. This creature is called in the Wagnerian cycle Alberich, and he is a Nibelung, or a dark elf, a kind of gnome, a distorted, disfigured creature that lives deep under the earth. And Alberich has come to steal the secret of the Rhine gold and to take the treasure from its lawful keepers. Now, in the old myths and legends, this power, this being, whom we represent as Alberich, tells us something about the story of the Nibelung. It is supposed that the Nibelung is simply a term to represent these elves, or these little elementary creatures. But actually, in the story, we find a little more subtle interpretation. The Nibelung is not really just a kind of creature, a little gnome or something of that kind. He is a person who is distinguished by the fact that he has stolen or he has killed. The Nibelung, therefore, represents the abuser, the misuser, the power of selfishness, of ambition and of arrogance, forming a strange deformity in nature. Therefore, when Fafnir kills his brother Giant to secure the treasure, he becomes a Nibelung. When Siegfried, in turn, slays Fafnir to gain the treasure, he also becomes a Nibelung. In other words, he becomes part of the tribe that has to do with the strange form of this curse. This is not as clearly revealed in Wagner as it is in the source books from which the material is taken. But we have to then consider that the Nibelung represents a genera, a kind of being or creature. In our particular case, we have a fair understanding of what is implied. Because the home of these creatures is below the earth and in darkness, And it represents a kind of Helheim, or dark world. It represents, furthermore, in the old myths, those creatures that crawled out of the primordial life of nature, the monsters and giants of the Chaldean theology, the strange, mindless, soulless creatures that crawled out into light. And in the case of Alberich, it represents matter seeking to steal away the power of reason or of mind. It is the lower world stealing away the power of the ego consciousness and taking it down into the material state to use it for the purposes of evil magic. Thus, pre-human forms, having captured the principle of I-amness, or of selfhood, drag it away in the form of the stolen treasure, and establishing themselves in their own dark world, try to use the magic of selfness to make themselves masters of the universe. We find as we go along that this story unfolds rather sequentially. But we must first of all now go back for a moment and develop a theme that lies earlier even than the Wagnerian cycle. So we go back to the entire concept which underlies it. And we know that we are dealing throughout the story with what is called the great hero cycle. And in each step and stage of the development of the drama, we find further representation of the concept of the world hero. So let us go back and try to understand this hero. And when we do so, we must go to the source work, which is the Volsunga Saga. This is the great epic work which deals with the race of the heroes, the selected people, those chosen to become the rulers of the world. This work describes how Odin, or Wotan, the All-Father, the one-eyed parent of men, called also the Chooser and the Waiter, caused to come forth out of himself a race for the redemption of the gods. This race for the redemption of the gods, this race that must save heaven because heaven could not save itself, this strange group of creatures that must be engendered and whose growth and development was watched constantly by the gods. For in this race was their own redemption, because it is through creation that the Creator must be justified. Therefore, the great work of the creation is to bear witness, reveal, and release the powers locked into it by the creating process. So in order to attain the great prophetic end, the end which was revealed to him out of the wisdom of his single eye, beholding all things, Odin brought forth the father of the Volsung, and his name was Sigi. And it was this Sigi who undoubtedly was actually the historical Scythian prince who, traveling from the Near East, established the great hierarchy of the Drots, or the religious system of the Nordic peoples. Now, in the New Testament, we are quite often concerned over the problem of the begats, but we have them again right at this particular time, so we have to consider them. And from Sigi descended the race of the Volsung. Now, the son of Sigi was Raya, king of Hunland, and he in turn was the father of Volsung. Therefore, we have appearing at this stage an interesting situation. For with the coming of the third generation, or Volsung, we have the statement that then was born Volsung of the Volsung. This is the first time we have the name doubled in this way. Volsung in turn became the father of Sigmund, and Sigmund's son, Sigurd or Siegfried, became the end of the great line of the Volsung. Now the line technically ended with Sigurd or Siegfried in the German, but actually Siegfried had a daughter, and this daughter, however, came to a tragic end because she was torn to pieces by wild horses, trampled to death. and with her death ended the entire race of the gods, or the God-protective generated creatures. Now, how shall we understand this strange descent of the chosen race, the race that was set aside to save the gods, and yet which in turn the gods themselves were forced to turn upon when this race broke the great laws of nature as represented in the story of Sigmund? Actually, we know that wherever a world hero is referred to, we are actually referring to the whole race of humanity. Therefore, just as Adam was certainly, as his name in Hebrew implies, not a person but a species, so each of these important steps in the descent of the Volsung should not be regarded as individuals but as stages in the unfoldment of mankind. We know from the Eastern tradition and also from a good part of our studies of anthropology that there have been in the world up to the present time 5 important major racial groups. These 5 racial groups, with the periods of their creation and development, correspond with the 5 generations of the Volsung. Thus, in the very beginning of time, we had the first species to appear, and this species, incidentally, as a result of certain ramifications, was involved with the creation of the giants and the various elves and so forth. In the Eastern tradition, this species is referred to as the Polarian species, the first type of creature that was to be potentially man that existed upon the earth. This creature, or this being, existed even before the surface of the earth hardened. He lived in a strange etheric atmosphere, for it was some time before the celebrated fall would take place, by which he was precipitated into a material existence. But the first of these strange creatures was not called a race, but a species, because it had not yet developed internal individuality. And thus we have this first, or Polarian species, related to Sigi, the first of the descending order of the Volsung. The second race, or creation, or species, more correctly, was called by the Greeks the Hyperborean, or the people who lived beyond and above the winds. This particular species represented a further gradual descent of man into a state of integration. He was still far more fantastic than any concept of the missing link. He belonged in a strange animal world. He was a beast among beasts, but with one difference. Within himself was locked the treasure of the Rhine. Within himself slept the Rheingold, the symbol of his own individuality. And therefore, although he could not be distinguished from other creatures, there was a separateness, a destiny which he could not withstand. And finally, in the 3rd generation of this family, there came forth Volsung of the Volsungs. And thus, in the 3rd great epic, called the Lemurian world, the division of mankind into its present human bisexual structure occurred, and we had the appearance of the first true human being. It is therefore appropriate that just as we refer to the total motion as humanity, that we should refer to this creature as human. And in this sense, we have the same idea as the Volsung of the Volsung, the human being of humanity, the double use of almost an identical term. Because now man had emerged, and we have the rise of true individuality and the beginning of life as we know it for humanity. This then resulted in the rise of the 4th great order of life, the 4th great continent, and the 4th race, which we generally refer to as the Atlantean. This is the race that gave us Sigmund, the hero who failed, the hero whose sword was broken upon the shaft of the rune spear of Odin. This was the disobedient one who did not even know his own disobedience, but was bound by a fate beyond his control to come to a tragic end. The tragic end of Sigmund was the tragic end of the Atlantean world. And out of the Atlantean world was born the fifth race, the race to which we now belong, a race which geographically originated in the Trans-Himalayan highlands of Central Asia. This was the race which originally called itself in India the Arya, or the consecrated, the set apart, the dedicated. All races have been so named. But this fifth race, which we generally refer to as the Aryan, is the race which is likened to Sigurd or Siegfried, in whom all the hopes of the past had been centered, and who it was hoped would prove to be the savior of the gods. Now, in the period of the height of the great Germanic concept, and Richard Wagner was one of the leaders of this concept of German culture as being supreme. We had the development and indoctrination of the concept of hyper-Aryanism, but this in no sense of the word relates primarily to the original concept, because actually the Aryas were a people that originated nearly 1 million years ago. And among the Aryas, you will find almost every type of people that we know on earth today. The Anglo-Saxon was not the one and only Aryan. The Aryas included the Hindus, the Persians, the modern Semites, the Celts, and many other culture racial groups. So that this idea of one small people constituting culture was a purely pro-Germanic approach to the problem. But here we have the development of races under the name of the sons of Volsung. Volsung is therefore the prototypic man, the Adam Kadmon, the collective humanity. And his children became one by one the embodiments of himself and the embodiments of his purpose. Therefore we also see a strange melancholy fatalism lurking underneath the story of the fifth race, or the race to which we belong. And this strange and rather pessimistic outlook is more or less supported by the ritual drama itself and by the great political drama of the world as we live in it today. Because we are more or less copying or reliving the sagas. The strange story which they told and which they predicted and prophesied is really unfolding around us. Now, this little concept of the racial orientation of things and of the place of the hero tells us, therefore, that when the world hero appears, he is the embodiment of a number of different things. First of all, he is a psychic symbol of the human soul itself. He is the symbol of the archetype of human perfection, which lies locked in every one. Secondly, he represents, in the operas particularly, the concept of intellect or mind as the hero of the world. He is also the ever-victorious and ever-defeated selfhood in everything that lives. He is the individual who seeks to conquer all things and fails because he has not conquered himself. His is therefore the strange tragedy of man conquering the universe but failing to be master of his own soul. Because upon him is a curse which he can do nothing about apparently, a curse that leads him inevitably to the grave, and that curse is his own egoism. It is the ring of fire within himself that will never let him rest, never give him peace, but drives him on to the greatest illusion of all, the belief that he can rule the world. And this belief lures him on into dictatorships and tyrannies, into the most terrible tragedies of human life. Now, in the development of our story, the theft of the Rheingold, or the misappropriation of energy or life, and it's being turned over to the keeping of Alberich the gnome, also tells another interesting story at the time of the division of species in the Lemurian era. Namely, that at that time some beings came forward and became human. Others, through various perversions, lost their right to this direct descent and became strange creatures, monsters, that gradually vanished in the deep. But there was a monster that did not die, and that monster was a certain phase of human life. And these people, these ancient Nordics, declared that there were in the world at all times two kinds of beings. Those who had their spirits and their souls from the gods, and those who inwardly and secretly had their souls and spirits only from the earth. As a result of that, there have been two orders of people, always distinguished and represented in human affairs. One we term the idealist and the other the materialist. The individual who instinctively seeks within for strength and security, and the individual who instinctively seeks in his environment or in the outer world. Perhaps these two are ultimately only phases of one kind of life, but they have been differentiated and distinguished from the earliest of times. So there are those who would live to conquer others, and there are those who live to conquer themselves. There are those who have become the servants of men and thus fulfill their destiny, and there are others who have tried to become the masters of men and have perished in their ambitions. So these two kinds of people more or less set the scene for the struggle between the hero race of the Volsung and the strange, negative, dark, perverted group which we call the Nibelung. Now the story goes back to many other moral depths, but we cannot attempt to explore them all at this time. We can only unfold a small part of the great story. Having thus come, however, to the theft of the Rhine gold, and the crime which set upon the world this great curse, we have to follow this curse through its various ramifications, and we have to introduce other persons into this drama. One of those that we must introduce is not only the ruler of this strange drama, but in some ways a strangely fated being himself, and that is the Allfather. The Allfather, Odin or Wotan, was not the original deity of this region. The oldest of the hero culture gods of the pre-Odinic period in Scandinavia was Thor, the great thunderer. He was a symbol of primordial strength, the strength of the Titan and of the ancient world. But when Odin came, he is said to have conquered Thor by the power of mind, and thus mind became master of matter, and mind became the undisputed ruler of the world. Now this in itself placed the entire universe at hazard, and this hazard is explained to us in the story of Odin himself. Odin discovered that through the power and skill which he possessed deep within his own nature, that he could solve all riddles, that he knew all things, and he caused to be inscribed upon the shaft of his lance the runes, the laws, the wisdom, the ancient truths of his people, and the most complicated formulas of magic. But Odin, wise and great though he was, ruler of the 12 aces that sat in council on Asgard on the great mountain of the world, Odin was not happy. He had several reasons for being unhappy, not the least of which was a nagging wife. Now this nagging wife, of course, was more or less a stickler for tradition. And whenever Odin, in his ambitions and in his personal escapades, overstepped himself a little, this nagging wife would step in and, as mistress of nature and of the laws governing nature, would insist that he mend his ways, regardless of cost. Now, apparently, from one of the old poems and the bard singers of these things, this nagging wife that so annoyed Odin was conscience, a strange and mysterious thing which kept whispering to him, and which kept telling him or intimating to him in some strange way that his own position was not secure, that he was not the person he thought he was. And the more this thought tormented him, the greater came his resolution to solve the deficiency within himself. Therefore, according to the ancient ritual story, Odin seeking the knowledge of things essential, seeking the basic facts of existence, performed a series of great sacrifices. He scarified himself. He injured his body. He shed his own blood in the search of truth. And he finally hung himself upon the branches of the tree of life. And still the secrets were not answered. Then he called upon the great spirit of the Earth Mother, and she told him that the great tree of life, the Yggdrasil tree, which grew up through the three worlds, was nourished in its roots by a secret fountain that lay far below the surface, where even the gods scarcely dared to go. And Odin, determined to solve the mystery of life at all cost, descended into the strange darkness of the underworld where the fountain flowed and where the worms waited to gnaw through the roots of the tree of life. And there he came to a pool of water, and on the wall of the pool was a great face that looked at him sadly, strangely, silently. And this was the face of Mimir. And Mimir was the deity presiding over memory and over all the strange secrets locked in the mind and soul of nature. And Odin besought of Mimir that he should be told the secrets of life. And Mimir told him that there were ways in which his wisdom could be increased, and that the only way in which some of the answers would be given to him would be if he plucked out his own eye and cast it into the pool of memory. So Odin instantly, to achieve his end, plucked out one of his own eyes, because Mimir had told him that if his eye was single, then his body would be filled with light. And having plucked out his eye and cast it into the pool, Mimir spoke to him. The oracle told him many, many things. But when he was finished, the oracle told him also one other thing. And later the great Earth Mother Erda substantiated the report, namely that no matter what Odin learned, no matter how much he knew, no matter how many secrets were open to him, he could never know the mystery of his own origin, his own essential nature, or his own destiny. These things even the gods could not know. And of course the reason they could not know is obvious. Again, a study of Vedanta or Buddhism or Yoga or Tantra will explain it very quickly. Namely, that the mind can never know the origin of life. The mind itself is limited to its own world. It can learn many secondary things, but the primary mysteries are locked from it forever. And another great symbol of the mind, who has just been brought to the motion picture screen in the Ten Commandments, Moses, symbol of wisdom, symbol of the guiding spirit of his people, the leader of the great pilgrimage out of Egypt and toward the promised land of Canaan. This pilgrimage is another version of the Rhine journey, the motion of peoples hoping to be led to security. But when they came at last to the entrance to the promised land, mind could not go in. And Moses went to sleep in the hills of Moab, and Jehoshua the son of Nun led the children of Israel into Canaan. The mind cannot go there. And wherever the intellect seeks the essential answer, that answer is denied. So Wotan, or Odin, as the symbol of the world mind, the demiurgus, or fabricator of the mundane creation, cannot know the secret of life, its origin, its existence, its substance, or its destiny. These things are left for something behind mind, something that rests forever in the keeping of the Rhine King, in the deep mystery of the ever-flowing waters of space, the Tao of the Chinese, the stream of life. Wotan, or Odin, however, was with certain help in these things, because mind has certain powers, or guides, or aids, or servants, which are very useful to it. These include the internal and external perceptive powers. And these perceptive powers are called, in the Nordic doctrines, the mind-born daughters of Wotan or Odin, and these are the Valkyrie, the hero maidens. And of course, the greatest of these is Odin's alter ego, his feminine daughter self, Brunhilde, who is his shield maiden, his guardian, his object of counsel. And when all the world fails Odin, and he is broken-hearted and he knows not what to do, he always sits down and discusses it with Brunhilde, who alone of all creatures actually understands him. And this understanding one is, of course, his own soul. And so the various elements of his nature and character are delineated. And Odin becomes this strangely perturbed being who must, in some way, develop a way to transcend the limitation of his own being. Now, Odin is the father of Sigi, who was created from him. Therefore, from Odin in turn, of all the races and orders of life come. And behind the archetypal man, Sigi, lies the great principle, or deity, within whom man lives and moves and has his being. The word man means manus, or is from that root, and implies the thinker. Therefore, the human being, rising gradually to its intellectual level, is unfolding the mind power of its original progenitor. And Odin is seeking constantly, through the extension of himself, through all the orders of life, to solve the mystery of his own origin and destiny. He realizes that his destiny is linked with his progeny, and that when the last mindful creature dies, mind dies. Therefore, he must die if his heroes die. He cannot survive them, for they are the instruments for the manifestation of his own intellect. In this way, we get a little further integration of the problem with which we are faced. So let us now make another brief study and take up the problem of this unpleasant little gnome, Alberich, who is constantly inserting himself into the picture. Now, Alberich has the power to steal the ring because of one quality which he possesses, and that is that he has forsworn love. In order, therefore, to become the possessor of power, man must forswear love. He must change the direction and purpose of his ambition. He must dedicate himself solely to the purpose of power. And because he has lost conscience, and because he has forsworn the deepest and richest of human emotions, it is possible for him to be dedicated completely to the fulfillment of ambition. And yet, here again, our Nibelungen friend must have a descent. There must be a descent in his line. And this descent must finally meet with the descent of Odin in the great struggle that is to come to pass. So what does Alberich do? Alberich forms a loveless marriage with a mortal woman. And from the union of these two is born a very strange person. A strange, dark, dour person. A person haunted constantly by the shadow of his own ancestor. And this person is called Hagen. And Hagen is represented in the opera, usually, as a typical Nordic knight, with his broad feathered helmet, and his great black shield, and his heavy black beard. And he is a very forbidding person. And he is the thrall of Gunther, chief of the Gibichung. Now, the Gibichung are a race or order of people that live along the shores of the Rhine, and they have a kind of little kingdom there. And the ruler of this group has a very beautiful sister, and there are many interesting personal evolvements which are going to take place in the story. But it is in the court of this Gunther that Hagen lives. And Hagen is, again, burdened forever with the strange ambition, the great longing urge to power. He must be master of men. And he has become a strange and terrible influence, even in the court of the Gewitschum. Now let's go back and study this particular little story for a moment and see what we can make out of it. Let us now imagine that, as Wagner did, that by Alberich we have the man who possesses the treasure or power of the ring. In other words, we have the beginning of two lines of descent which Wagner unfolds. The most simple, obvious, and commonplace of these interpretations is that the ring represents gold and represents the curse of wealth, that it represents the entire tragedy of man dedicated to the accumulation of worldly goods. That gold has turned brother against brother and father against son and has brought one culture down after another upon the altars of personal ambitions. That gold is the terrible monster, and that until the age of gold is restored to its original glory as the golden age, we will never have relief from this terrible emergency. But what is gold actually but a symbol? Therefore, the thing that is behind gold is the fact that it has meaning. This gold that is buried under the ground here in the United States has no actual value except to gild picture frames and make high-grade dentures. That's about all it is worth. It has no meaning, but it has a tremendous glittering aura around it, because gold has become the symbol of power. Power is a way in which man defines will. It becomes the symbol in the material world of the instinct of will within himself. Power is the thing for which men have betrayed men since the beginning. And power is the desire of man to rule, to dominate, to master, to become the complete ruler of the material world in which he lives. So Wagner tells us in Double Talk one very simple thing, that the power of the ring falling into the hands of materialism has caused a strange union between an elemental of the underworld and a human woman, and that from these two has been born the strange, foreboding symbol of the union of divine knowledge and earthly greed. And that this union we call today by the rather delicate, scientific, and pleasant name of science. Science is the union of divine energy and mortal ignorance. It is the symbol of a magnificent universal agent which has fallen into the keeping of a gnome, this gnome being unenlightened mankind. And out of the union of human primordial selfishness, out of the lack of insight which marks the material state of man, and the union of this strange, mysterious, magical agent that can apparently do anything man wants it to do, has come this strange fetish, this ultimate determination of man to so increase in his mastery of the universe that he can actually conquer space. He may, there's no reason why he can't, but the whole situation is turned upon him as a horrible curse. And this horrible curse is perhaps as well represented by our present researches in atomics as in any other direction. It is ambition, it is knowledge, it is this endless pursuit of science by science, without moral or ethical overtones or implications, that places the world at the mercy of the one who knows, but not at the keeping or in the keeping of the one who knows what is right. And there is great difference between these things. So the union of ignorant humanity and a scheming dwarf produces the assassin, Hagen. Produces the man miserable in himself, haunted constantly by the secret pressures of his ancestrals' ambitions. This being, who lives as a constant embodiment of treachery and deceit, and who ultimately plunges his spear into the back of Siegfried, thus ending forever the hope of the hero race. In other words, Hagen, representing materiality, material knowledge, threatens the survival of the spiritual dynasty, threatens the survival of the God-born creation, which was intended to serve a certain end. Yet this God-born creation was not the product of the great keeper of mysteries, the master of the Rhine. It was the creation and product of Allfather, Odin of the one eye, and therefore this whole creation exists only within the plane of mental phenomena. It cannot transcend it, and regardless of the part played by Hagen, the entire scheme must ultimately have failed. Odin knew that it had to fail. Odin knew from the beginning, as the old sagas tell us, that his entire venture was in vain, but that he would prolong it and continue it as much as possible. So here we have several of the characters or persons of our story. And in order to advance it as rapidly as we can, we have to eliminate a good part of the romantic and dramatic development and try to trace through the main theme or the main thread of the account. The account, as we say, extends itself through 4 elements. These elements are represented by symbolic creatures and experiences, and by various steps and stages in the story itself. The 4 parts of the ring, therefore, correspond to the 4 elements: earth, fire, air, and water. And they also represent or embody the 4 vehicles or bodies of man: the mental, emotional, vital, and physical. Because all of this drama takes place within mundane nature, within the sphere of man's activities. And just as the story of Parsifal is built upon the number 5, which is the symbol of soul, so the ring of the Nibelung is built upon the number 4, which is the symbol of matter, which is the symbol, therefore, in an involved and complicated manner, of the entire concept of the fall of man, even as Parsifal is key to the entire concept of regeneration. In the story, we thus find the emergence of Siegfried. And Siegfried, who represents the 5th race, is also the son of the widow. Now this is a very interesting parallel because it takes us back to the Egyptian story of Horus, posthumously conceived after the death of his father. After the death of Sigmund, Sieglinde bears a son, and this son is Siegfried, or Sigurd, the hero of the world. He is like also Parsifal, whose mother Hetzelida is the sorrow of the world and who never knew his father. This strange, peculiar parallel of the son of the widow goes back also into the Manichaean mysteries and is still preserved in certain of the symbolisms of modern Freemasonry. Therefore, this symbol has meaning and has a great significance. He is born of the widow. In other words, if we go to the rituals of the mysteries, he is born of the sanctuary or the sacred house of the rites, which is widowed by the martyrdom of the god and the loss of the living word, or the symbol of power. Sigurd, therefore, like all of the other world heroes, embodies or personifies the concept of an initiate or an adept of the mysteries. The 4 symbols that he is associated with represent the 4 ritual degrees of initiation, which we will find much more simply presented to us in the opera by Mozart, The Magic Flute, where the initiation of the 4 elements is clearly set forth. But in the story of Sigurd, we find certain labors associated with him. Therefore, being widowed, they produced from themselves the hero race, the race of the initiates that were to restore the truth. These are the Heshespi, or the golden hawks of Egypt, who were to avenge the death of Osiris and restore him to glory. In other words, to restore the full secret of the ancient mystery rites. All of these rites were imperfect, and in every one of them it was stated that a word, a symbol, a great emblem of power was lost. The search for this lost thing is represented in the precipitation of the entire race of the Volsung. Sigurd, or Siegfried, then, has not only the meaning of the hero being, but it is also the symbol of the human soul, which is the widow's son. And this human soul must ultimately conquer the body and must finally rise in victory over the material world. But when this soul is betrayed by the mind and is led into ways of materiality, it is said to enter the house of the Gibbachung, where it takes or is drugged with the wine of forgetfulness, forgets its heavenly bride or its celestial mate, Brunhilde, and leads itself into a series of confusions which ultimately result in not only the death of Siegfried, but the great immolation scene in which Brunhilde takes her own life. All of these episodes are highly psychological and have to do with the entire compound structure of the human psychic life. Now, we've already mentioned that Odin, in his effort to accomplish his own end, precipitated the 5 generations of the Volsung. The mind, in order to attain its particular purpose, caused to emerge from itself the 5 senses. And the 5 senses, in turn, are what Buddha called the machine of the senses, by means of which the illusion of self-security or self-existence is perpetuated indefinitely. In the book of Revelation, we have a further development of this concept on another level. And we find that all of these symbols, the seals of revelation, the churches of Asia, and all of these things have to do with levels of illumination or internal self-discipline. And that actually the 5th of these levels, the one which corresponds to Sigmund, or rather Sigurd in this story, corresponds with the 5th chakra of Raja Yoga. And this 5th chakra is placed in the throat, and it is the chakra which has to do with speech, with voice, and with the intonation of the sacred word, a speech symbol or a sound symbol which Wagner attempts to capture in the mysterious and curiously constructed trumpet call which is constantly present with Sigurd as part of his identification. We find the hero, then, mysteriously born without knowledge of his own destiny, moved inevitably through the great course which is to lead him finally to his death. He floats down the river Rhine, passing through numerous adventures and numerous incidents, until finally he comes to the place in which the tragedy is to be completed. Here we have another important group of symbols. Of course, as we go on with this study, we find another possible clue to the concept of the cyclic power of the ring. The ring, of course, is actually the Buddhist wheel of life. The ring is also the symbol of rebirth and of all the whole cycle of attendant consequences which have to do with re-embodiment. For the journey of the soul, the Rhine journey, is the soul journey of man. Not only a journey through the years of a life, nor the journey of the descent of races, but the journey of the soul itself in space, searching for some solution to its own existence. Up to the present time, Wagner is pessimistic. He has seen this journey lead man only finally to the house of the Gibbachung. And by going back again to the old Eddas and sagas, we can get a much better understanding of this. What we call always, in our way of thinking, now, this place, that where we are at present, is always the end of the journey up to now. Therefore, our present contemporary way of life is the court of the Gibachung. It is a rather fine, splendid-looking establishment, and Siegfried, as a symbol of the evolving humanity, coming into this place, forms an alliance of blood brotherhood with the prince or chief of the house. Everything is done to make his stay pleasant and to make his visit one to bring happiness and festivity and rejoicing to everyone. And the wonderful little scenes which accompany the reception of Siegfried and all the things about it are just a little reminiscent, perhaps, of the celebrations which accompany the birth of the human being. Everyone is so glad he has arrived. He forms a happy alliance. He is a welcome guest in the house. And everyone more or less agrees to do all that is possible to make life enjoyable and happy for him, except one, Hagen. Hagen will not bind himself with blood brotherhood to anybody. Hagen just simply sits and knows that every being that comes into the world may be the promised hero who will overthrow selfishness and end the realm and reign of deceit. So Hagen is ever watchful, and his ancestor Alberich whispers to him that the visitor who has come might and should be and is this hero of the world, so that the hero self in man must be destroyed or he is not safe. Emerson summarizes perhaps the moral of this when he says, all the world is at hazard when God lets loose a thinker. In other words, the newborn being, the human being, the humanity in man, the hero soul, always threatens the survival and the ambition of the dark, brooding form of Hagen. And Hagen is this strange collective evil in the world, the strange weight and pressure of old tradition, the status quo that must never be interfered with, the brooding monuments of the past which dominate our lives and which settle down to the quiet task of destroying us. Hagen represents the world opposed to the soul. He represents the skill, the power, the cunning of the world, as opposed to the principle of truth and right. He will not accept blood brotherhood with anyone. He will not give allegiance to anyone. But gradually this Hagen, who is the thrall of Gunther, becomes the bane of Sigurd. In other words, he becomes strangely his mortal enemy, because it is a struggle to the death between the symbol of truth and the symbol of error. And Siegfried, while he represents only a conditioned symbol of truth, still is the threat. He is the one who must be destroyed in order that the plan of the Nibelung shall be achieved. He is the embodiment of the idealist, who is forever a menace to the realism of our time. Wagner locks this situation in the house of the Gibachung, which is contemporary culture or contemporary civilization as we know it. A place which seemingly offers hospitality to all, but within which lurks this dark being who can be the friend to none, to whom friendship is unknown, and who was born of lovelessness and has been nursed by hate. Only one thing rules this thrall of Gunther, and that is the will to power. This is Schopenhauer's will to power, Nietzsche's will to power. This is the cult of the Superman, represented and personified in the descendants of the Nibelung, who were little and dwarfed by nature, but by fortunate circumstance were able to conceal their deformity, but could never conceal the dark and shadowy evil of their souls. Here, then, is a conflict which arises in society, and which the legend carefully cultivates and makes available to us. Hagen has the entire world of natural magic available to him. And because of the word and advice and knowledge which he receives from his ancestor Alberich, he has learned to know the secrets of art. And from the offended Brunhilde, he learns of the vulnerability of Sigurd. He learns, for example, that Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the St. George of Cappadocia, the same dragon slayer as Isdubar, who slew the ancient Babylonian dragon, that this symbol of the dragon slayer achieves a kind of immortality by bathing in the blood of the dragon. And Sigurd did this, and all parts of his body were invulnerable, except one place, where a leaf fell upon his back, a leaf of a tree, the tree of fate, and that this leaf left him vulnerable in one place. And it is in this one place, which was vulnerable like the heel of Achilles, that Hagen, having discovered the secret, thrust the lance which destroyed Sigurd. All this is part of the same general theme, namely that man becoming invincible by bathing himself in the blood of material power and earthliness is still vulnerable. There is still always a part or place which is not protected. And man, no matter how completely he builds around himself the wall of his own closed-mindedness, of his own dedication to materialism and everything that it represents, no individual can achieve immortality by the power of the mind or of reason. No matter how strong we become, we are not safe. No matter how learned we become, we are not happy. Always in this strange mortal tragedy, man seeking immortality must die. This goes on to unfold the fatal phases of the story. Now let us go back again into the cosmic side of it for a moment and see what was supposed to be happening in space during the time in which the great closing cycle of the Götterdämmerung was taking place. It seems that fate, a mysterious symbol represented by three sisters, the Norns, who are forever braiding and unbraiding, tying and untying, weaving and unweaving the threads of destiny, that these three mysterious dark sisters are aware of the fact that there is a strange and inevitable destiny that shapes our ends, rough hew them though we may. And gradually the gods, realizing that the great plan of the heroes is failing, that it is only a matter of time before Hagen, representing the complete embodiment of the adversary, will achieve his purpose, set themselves quietly upon their ancient thrones and wait in complete resignation, hopeless and profound, for the coming of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And the signs which lead to this terrible occasion are found to be present in all parts of the universe. For when the great day comes, the warning will be blown by the trumpeter of heaven who stands guarding the bridge of rainbows which connect heaven and earth. This is Hindal, the keeper of the great trumpets. And he is the one that lets the gods know that the night is coming. And how do they know this? Because slowly all of the great bonds of magic, the runes which they whispered, the spells which they cast, all these strange and wonderful things begin to unwind and fall apart. And it seems that Loki, the god of fires, the Lucifer of this pantheon, who had been bound under the earth with a serpent dropping venom upon him, Loki broke his bonds and dashed forth ravaging upon the earth. And the great wolf, Fenris, came out of the darkness, howling and with fangs bared, And the ship of lost souls came out of the underworld, a ship made of the fingernails of the damned. And on this were ghosts and demons and monsters and all strange, hideous things. And as the gods waited, they felt the very world beneath them shaking. For the worms, the horrible little things that had been gnawing at the roots of the tree of life, gnawed through the roots. And the great world tree, Yggdrasil, shook upon its foundations and shuddered. And one by one, all of the strange elementary forces of nature were loosed again. And then came the Ragnarok. Then came the Nordic version of the Armageddon. This was the last great war between the gods and the demons. And from every mysterious vastness of the underworld and of the far places came the monsters. The Midgard snake, which twisted around the earth in the oceans, shook forth from the sea and came crawling as a terrible monster upon the land. All these things were the omens, the forebodings of the end that was to come. And finally Heimdall blew his great trumpet, and the gods came forth. And they came forth upon the plain of Ragnarok before the walls of Valhalla and Asgard, and drew up their armies. And the armies of the gods consisted of the heroes that had been picked up by the Valkyrie from the fields of battle, the hero dead, whose souls would form the great army of the protectors. And against them came this great array of evil powers. And so the gods and the monsters were locked in a struggle to the death in a great battle. One by one the monsters were killed. One by one the gods died, killing them. And even great All-Father himself perished in mortal combat with the monsters of darkness. And as the gods fell and their armies ceased, the great throne of Valhalla was shaken, and all the world, moved as by some terrible earthquake and tempest, collapsed into the great sea of space. Collapsed, falling, until all parts of it were submerged except the peak of one mountain. One mountain remained above the deluge, for this was indeed the great flood that destroyed the world. And with the world went the gods and the demons to a common destruction. Everything perished together except two mortals, a man and a woman, who had hidden themselves in this cave on the top of a mountain. And they became the progenitors of a new race, a new way of life. They were the ones who were saved. And from them came a world that no longer knew of the struggle of gods and demons, no longer knew of the old ways that had been. And after the great night of the gods, the sun rose up on this mountain peak and prepared the way for the salvation of the world. In the Sigurd Saga, and as it is presented by Wagner, these factors all coincide with the closing scene of the Götterdämmerung. The entire episode is highly condensed, but its implications are quite clear. Siegfried is dead, lying upon the funeral pyre, wearing upon his finger the cursed ring of the Nibelung that he wore even in death. Every effort to take it from his finger had failed, because the thief, even as he reached for it, the hand closed upon it. It could not be removed even in death, for even in death man cannot forget his ambition to power. That, according to Buddhism, is why he must be reborn again. And so the funeral pyre is there, and Brunhilde appears, and mounting upon her white horse, after her great immolation scene, she rides into the funeral pyre to die with Siegfried. At the same time, the river Rhine rises, breaking through its banks by a strange flood, for this river Rhine is, of course, the German version of the great ocean into which the world fell. And as the river Rhine rises, the plaintive song of the Rhine maidens is heard. They are waiting for the return of the ring which is theirs. And in this last moment, Hagen makes his supreme effort. Dashing upon the scene, he finally succeeds in wrenching the ring from the dead fingers and jumps into the river to swim away with it. The Rhine maidens drag him down into the depths of the river, and he perishes, struggling to keep possession of the ring. Slowly the flames of the background rise higher and higher, and the stage setting implies that in their great palace the gods are waiting for the end. This is the great symbol of the fire that destroys the world, till it all falls together, in the Nordic version, into the Rhine, and nothing remains but the water, going on and the strange, mysterious theme of the Rhine music. This is the great tragedy of mankind. The tragedy of the fall of worlds and of empires, and the fall of human ambitions, and death cheating each individual of the glory of his worldly power. The ring finally returns to the Rhine, returns to the mysterious beings who keep it, and to whom it rightfully belongs. But the long search for the treasure has been one great tragedy. Each person who touched it fated to die, each one given the opportunity to return it and failing. At no time was it not possible, by a single act of enlightened will, to return the ring and break the curse. But no one did it. Each, for a different motive, held on to the ring. Some for pride, some because they were coaxed, and others simply because nature wanted it back. Just this strange orneriness of human beings, this unwillingness to do the thing that is simple and next. The ring, therefore, again, has a very important symbol. Any time in the growth of mankind when man will return the government of power to its rightful owner, the universe will be at peace. The moment man obeys instead of disobeying, the moment he acknowledges that the ring belongs in the river, that it belongs in the keeping of the great Rhine king, as soon as man does not try to keep for himself that which can never be his own justly, as soon as man realizes this, he would break the curse of the ring. But he does not realize and will not accept. Again, this signifies the relaxation of the power mania, or the power complex. As soon as man, for instance, actually says in his own soul, "Not my will, but the divine will be done," the ring is returned to the river. The moment the individual accepts the laws of the universe, lives them, and no longer tries to build a world apart from them, as soon as man breaks this competitive spirit between himself and his universe, he will no longer be the subject of the great tragedy. The gods disobeyed and fell, and they paid ultimately for their disobedience in the blazing chaos of the Götterdämmerung. Man disobeying pays for his disobedience upon the funeral pyre. But always the ring could be returned. Always it represents power which, if restored to the law, restored to the keeping of the great principles which guard it, restored to the Rhine maidens, who symbolize time as the dimensions of duration and dimensions as the elements of nature and of the formal universe. When this gold is returned to them, their power, their secret, and they can guard it in their own way, the curse ends. But it is never returned by man until he has paid for it with his own life. In the Eastern symbolism, the same type of parallel exists. Man can attain immortality only by returning his own individuality to the universal. He becomes immortal only when he casts from himself his own ego. When he returns to the sea of life, his own individuality, he becomes universal. When he returns to infinite being, the finite nature of his own personal existence, he becomes infinite. If, therefore, he has the strange supreme wisdom to practice the mystery, he can then rescue not only himself, but the gods. For man rescuing consciousness from intellect restores the realms and powers of the celestial beings. Behind Odin is the pure mystery of consciousness itself. And we can pause again to consider another phase of this legend. In the very beginning, it is said, there was nothing but space. There was nothing but eternal being. And this eternal being, existing, surviving, going on forever, slowly a motion came within it, the motion of life. This was the primordial motion of the ring, because it is the nebula, the symbol of the rise of energy. And from primordial motion, space or eternity was divided into two parts, a superior and an inferior part. And the heavens which were above the earth were divided from the heavens which were beneath the earth. And in this beginning then were created the heavens and the earth, the above and the below, the superior and the inferiors, reality and illusion, truth and error. And in the Nordic version, this division resulted in two great cliffs, two wonderful walls that seemed to rise up like perhaps we might imagine the walls of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, two great walls. And between them an immense abyss, a great cleft in space that went all the way down into the unfathomable abyss, because this cleft was cut with the sword of the gods, the sword that was later broken upon the spear of Sigmund, upon the spear of Wotan, was later mended and repaired by Sigurd, and became the mysterious sword of power, the same sword that we find in the Excalibur of King Arthur. This is the sword of enlightened purpose, or as the Hindu calls it in the Gita, take the sword of quick detachment and cut the snaky branches low, referring to the tree of illusion, or to the illusional world represented by the dragon and many other things. In any event, this sword cut the great cleft in space which was called Ganunga Gap. And here was a great abyss. And on the cliffs and the walls on each side were giants, frost giants and flame giants. Those upon the north were of frost, and those on the south were of flames. And they cast their flames and their ice into the great abyss, and a great steam arose, what is called hoarfrost. And out of this was formed the body of Ymir, the frost giant, the primordial being, the great body of creation. Semi-animate, semi-inanimate. It writhed and twisted and moaned in space for ages. And this great body then produced from itself all kinds of strange beings. And among those things that came out of it was the great cow mother. And this cow mother found herself in a world of ice. And she licked the ice to get salt. And when she licked the ice, she licked out of it three gods who were frozen or imprisoned in it. And the chief of these was Odin. And Odin turned upon the great frost giant, Ymir, and slew it. And from the decaying body of this giant came forth strange maggot-like creatures that were to be animals and insects. And from its hair was created forests, and from its eyebrows the boundaries of the world. And its skull was raised upon the shoulders of four gnomes that were called Audrey, Sudri, Nordri, and Vestri, from which we have our north, east, south, and west. And the heavens were filled with clouds, which were the thoughts of Ymir. And the blood of Ymir were the sea and the rivers. And out of all parts of this primordial giant was fashioned the world, and over it ruled Odin. But Odin, mind, became ruler of a chaos which it had brought into existence by killing. It had destroyed this ancient primordial monster and usurped its power. Therefore, even in this early page, we find mind with its strange victory over chaos. Mind gradually organizing the universe, slaying the primordial force, organizing, integrating, creating, until it brought into existence human society. For what is society but a monument, a structure based upon the foundations of the giant of savagery? What is all that we know except a fashioning of primitive things into things more recognizable and more apparently suitable to us? And Odin thus became the ruler of this mundane world, a world which he had fashioned with his skill, and which mind continues to fashion, and over which it rules with a frightened existence throughout the whole lapse of time. Thus the creation of the world follows the Orphic tradition, and it represents also the divisions within consciousness, divisions by which finally consciousness itself is obscured and lost in the creations which it supports. And if we go back to the instruction that was given to the novices in the old Gothic rites concerning these things, we shall find a great deal of very interesting and useful information. They all believed definitely that the supreme deity, the absolute ruler of all things, was this mysterious space, this formless, shapeless, eternal power that endured forever. They also held that this and this alone really existed. Everything else was subject to decline or change. Nothing was changeless but space. Nothing was immortal but space. And this strange space being, this strange space ever becoming, was the source of life, the reservoir of all energies and of all principles and of all powers. And while it slept on through its own great eternal rest, there was no death, there was no darkness, there was no decay. But in the course of ages, just as the rhythm of the ring meant that periodically the Rheingold came to life, so in the depths and eternity of space itself there was a strange rhythm under the law of the Rhine King, or the Space King. And this rhythm meant that space periodically, spontaneously became fruitful and caused to emerge from itself in what Plato calls the great cycles of alternate fertility and sterility. In the periods of fertility, space bore. It caused to come from itself the seminal principles of things. And from the great darkness and eternity of space came forth the twofold powers. And these, ether and chaos, according to the Greeks, represented the active and passive polarities of space. And from the minglings, confusings, and battlings of these two were formed the primordial giant of creation. Now, creation is not just our earth or our world. Creation is the gradual emergence of matter. And Yima, the frost giant, is the symbol of matter, locking again within itself this inevitable mass of little minute seminal lives, which are referred to as maggots and crawling things. It is Odin's mind that slays the principle of matter and begins the process of molding matter into form. And this form world is born between the two great polar cliffs of the Gununga Gap, and is represented by alternate currents of electrical and magnetic energy. And mind, or the world intellect, corresponding to the Greek deity Zeus, begins to fashion the mundane sphere out of the ashes of the giants and the blood of Bacchus. It is a strange, mysterious production. And out of this mystery comes something, form. And form is the great compound. And is the reason, perhaps, for the lines upon the supposed monument of Lord Bacon at St. Albans, the final observation of a wise man: let all compounds be dissolved. The moment there is compound, dissolution is inevitable. The moment things exist in patterns, these patterns are vulnerable. Because these patterns are held together by energy, by a particular and special kind of effort, called in India will or yoga. And this means that all forms exist only because of consciousness concentrated upon them, holding them together, binding them, serving as a perpetual binder of their particles and elements. The moment consciousness is relaxed, form disappears. returning again to its primordial elements, just as the body, after the soul has departed, returns again to the earth from whence it came. Thus, compounds are preserved only because they are enlivened, because they are ensouled by an agent greater than themselves. And wherever this ensouled power exists, greater than that which it ensouls, it can be separated from it. And whenever this separation takes place, compounds are dissolved. Therefore, the whole world and all the mysteries of it, all the strange pageantries and shapes which it supports, all these things are held together by the power of mind. A strange, mysterious agent. This mind can will them into existence. This mind can maintain them with its thought. This mind can decide for them a great and future destiny. But if this mind ever sleeps, if this mind ever rests, if this mind ever turns its attention from this project, these things dissolve and become truly like the insubstantial pageantry of a dream. So the gods hold the world in the grasp of mental energy. And by mental energy, Wotan becomes the sovereign intellect of the world. By mental energy, he seeks to scheme its perpetuation. For man, who is an embodiment of mind, is forever scheming his own perpetuation. He wants the institutions that he has to go on. He wants the deeds that he has done to be remembered. He wants those who come after him to know that he has lived. And he also wishes to burden, if possible, the unborn future with his opinions, his convictions, his beliefs. And he is making laws today which he hopes will bind the ages. And yet, in a single instant, this mind ceases. And when a man passes out of this life, it does not seem to him that he dies, but that the world dies. Inasmuch as in this single action, he has removed his attention or his mental focus from a sphere of activity, and that activity fades away as though it never existed. So man, building with mind, builds this tremendous hero saga, creating for himself the concept of the world hero that is the embodiment of adequate mind. This mind is ultimately going to master everything. This mind, taking form in the arts and sciences and its numerous heroes, is going to save the world. It is going to bring the perfect civilization. It is going to end economic imbalance. It is going to ultimately bring about the arbitration of wars. It is going to improve and perfect United Nations and Hague conferences and Geneva conferences until all things are solved. It is going to make available to man all things necessary to man, and is to build a perfect world for him. So mind becomes the symbol of an heroic program. And this mind is indeed the embodiment or the symbol of the hero race. For man is the hero, who up to now has exploited every other part of nature shamefully, but still looks forward to rightful possession of that which he has woefully abused. So man goes on, thundering down through the ages, and the institutions which he builds never change. Here we are after 5,000 years of archaic education, and yet today, the moment we try to change anything, progress is blocked. We must go on. We must do it our way, because like the hero Siegfried, we hear the voice of the Rhine maidens pleading with us to return the gold, to return the ring. We have already experimented with the mystery of the Tarnhelm and all the magic works of science worked in the laboratory of the Nibelung. We have learned tragedy after tragedy, but when we feel within ourselves that the universe wants us to obey, to return these powers to the keeping of spirit rather than locking them within the embrace of ambition, we close ourselves. We will not return the ring. We will not return the human spirit to God. We will not bring it back to obedience. We will not help it to be replaced in the great stream of life, the Tao, by which it might move victoriously on through time. We are the children of a rebel angel, and we are destined and determined to build our empire in the abyss that shall rival the empire of heaven. And so by self-will we die, even as by universal will we are redeemed. So this is the story of the whole pageantry of the conflict between self-will and universal will. Self-will, first personified by Odin, keeps on extending through the creations of self-will, the ingenious methods for making this go on regardless, and finally the ultimate tragedy of self-will. For that which lives by will must die by will, and that which won its way by the sword must perish by the sword. These laws are in the keeping of someone greater. And behind all these things lurks the strange, quiet, mysterious form of Erda, the great oracular earth herself. And in the sagas and Eddas, Erda plays a great part because she is nature. And Odin at times calls upon her and pleads with her to tell him the secret of his own fate. And in the ancient sagas, it is Erda who always suffers as the result of the things that men do. Because in doing these selfish, ambitious things, men hurt nature. Men break the laws of nature. Men are therefore raised in rebellion against her. But nature, ever quiet, ever silent, knows that her ways will be ultimately accepted. So Erda waits in patience, always waiting for men to come to nature to learn the truth, seeking not within their own ambitions, but within the soul and life of things. Nature teaches by experience. Nature is the oracle, and is ever tracing the true answers to mysteries. And Erda beseeches them to come and learn her ways and be truly wise. So Odin goes to her and pleads with her, and she instructs him. But he is proud, and he turns from nature and goes back to his own ambitions. Man also, listening to the voice of nature, watching around him, could learn as Lao Tzu learned, that by silent receptivity to the magnificent message of natural processes, men could be truly wise. But they turn from nature to the works of their own ingenuity. Men no longer live with nature. They live in cities and towns where they can no longer see the sunrise or the sunset. Nature has become something strange, distant, remote, and inconsequential. Their own works have become magnificent monuments to be adored. So man, worshipping his own mistakes down through the ages, venerating them, adoring them, and copying them, goes ever further from the keeping of ancient Erda, who alone, perhaps, of all creatures, really knows the answer. And, of course, she is not telling it to arrogant men. She is saving it, perhaps, for those two little people who were hidden in the cave, and upon whom the future destiny of the earth must depend. So Erda is the great oracle of nature, the oracle of true wisdom, which is so simple that Odin cannot understand. So all the elements of this story fit together and make a wonderful account of actions and reactions, of processes and forces, of the strivings of space and time. And like most other scriptural writings, they conceal in wonderful patterns truths that are eternal and profoundly significant. Out of many of these elements, Wagner has combined the elements of his music dramas. But there is no question in the world that he was emphasizing primarily one phase, and that was this ethical story of the struggle of man against the productions of his own selfish instincts. That man, representing the true hero of the world, is floating inevitably to his own doom down the river Nile in his strange little ship, down the river Rhine in his strange little ship, floating to his fatal meeting with the Gibachun, floating to the final embrace with materialism, in which, accepting ultimately materialism as absolutely real, forming a blood brotherhood with matter instead of with spirit, comes inevitably under the watchful eye of Hagen, who is resolved through selfishness to possess the treasures of the human soul. And Hagen, representing the secret power ruling materialism, will conspire always to bring about the death of the hero, as materialism gave Socrates the cup of hemlock, Christ the cross, and Muhammad the poison of Cabala. In every case, the great materialism closing in upon consciousness is a murderer. If it does not murder the body, it tortures the soul. If it does not destroy man immediately, it destroys him eventually by indoctrinating him with false teachings which bring him finally to destruction and death. This is the burden of Wagner's approach, but he does intimate in the closing notes of his great ritual the hope of the better day. Can the new race which is to come survive? Can the daughter who died trampled to death by horses, the daughter of Siegfried, mysteriously point the way to another race? According to the ancient writings, there must be a sixth race, a sixth child of the Volsung. We do not know who it is, but when we go into the Parzival story, we are going to look around a little and see what we can locate. But there must be six of these orders of descent. And then finally the seventh, which is the Sabbath, the day of rest, the day of the atonement and the achievement. The struggle of life through the 6 days of creation must ultimately be consummated in the victory of the seventh. The sixth generation appears in the ancient Volsung saga in the form of these two little people of unknown origin who were saved. And if we are to find the answer to this mystery, we must search further, because we will almost certainly find that these two little people also, in some strange way, were of the blood of the Volsung. They have to be, because the story has to go on. It is the drama of life and of nations, of peoples, of races, of worlds, and of man's struggle to achieve for himself permanence, security, in a world where these do not exist. Therefore he must fail until he listens to the voices of the Norns and of Erda, the Great Mother, amends his ways, returns the ring, breaks the curse, and saves not only himself but the gods. How this is accomplished is really rather well set forth in the story of Parzival and the Grail. For as the ring is the Old Testament of the Wagnerian cycle, so the Grail story is the New Testament. And these together form the law and the prophets, the two dispensations as represented in the great mythological mystery systems of the ancients upon which Wagner drew for his inspiration. Now I think our time is up for this evening, so we hope to meet with you.